The cafe opened at 7, but Walter was always there by 6:50. He liked the quiet before the cups began to clink, before the espresso machine hissed its first breath. At that hour, sound still had edges, the scrape of a chair, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of rain against the window. He sat by the corner table, a small ceramic cup in front of him, steam rising and fading like a thought he couldn't hold on to. The young waitress, maybe in her 20s, passed by with her earbuds in. He said softly, "Good morning, Kelly." She smiled without looking up. Her voice came back faintly, "Morning, Mr. Greer." And then the music in her ears drowned out the rest. He stirred the coffee once, listening to the spoon-touch porcelain. That sound used to fill classrooms. For 30 years, his voice had carried across desks, over restless teenagers, through days of chalk dust and report cards. He remembered the rhythm of it, the pause before a question, the lift before a name. Now the rhythm had nowhere to go. At 72, Walter had become a listener in a world that rarely listened back. He noticed it everywhere, at the grocery store checkout where the cashier never looked up, in the small talk after church, where people spoke in bursts and left mid-sentence, in the neighborhood meetings where voices overlapped until meaning got lost. When he tried to speak, conversations kept moving like rivers around a stone. He told himself it was normal, age, volume, irrelevance. But the truth landed heavier. He wasn't being heard. Not because his words had changed, but because the world's speed had. One Sunday afternoon, he found himself at the local library, waiting out the rain. A volunteer coordinator, a cheerful woman named Denise, asked if he would read aloud a short passage for the community youth group gathering upstairs. "It's just a few pages," she said. "Something from To Kill a Mockingbird. They love hearing real voices." He almost declined. His throat felt dry from years of saying less. But something in her tone, the easy assumption that he still could, made him nod. Upstairs, about 20 young faces looked up from their phones. The room smelled of paper and damp coats. Denise handed him the book, open to the courtroom scene. He cleared his throat once. The sound cracked slightly, and he almost apologized, but didn't. He began. "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view." His voice, deep and steady, filled the air with a kind of slowness that didn't demand attention, it invited it. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Someone's phone dimmed to black. By the second paragraph, the scraping of chairs stopped. By the third, silence had a weight. He could hear himself again, not the volume, but the presence. Each word landed cleanly, the way rain finds its rhythm against glass. When he finished, nobody clapped. They just sat there, still. One girl whispered, "That sounded different." He smiled, confused, a little embarrassed. Different how? He hadn't changed anything, same words, same sentences, same tone he'd used 1,000 times in his classroom. On his walk home, the air smelled of wet cedar. He thought about the moment of quiet before his first word, how it had stretched wider than he expected. He thought about how the room had listened itself into silence. That night, he sat by his kitchen table, the clock ticking behind him. He tried reading the same passage again, this time to no one. The refrigerator hummed, the house creaked, but in that stillness he heard something new. His own breath pacing his thoughts. It wasn't power he missed all those years. It was resonance. And maybe, he realized, people didn't stop listening because he got older. Maybe they just forgot how to hear the kind of quiet that his voice carried now. He took a sip of water, let the silence settle. Somewhere outside, a train passed. Its low rumble matched the tone of his last word. That's when he realized. It wasn't the world that needed to turn down its noise. It was him who needed to remember that a calm voice could still fill a room. And that was how recovery began. Not by shouting louder, but by learning to speak from stillness again. When Walter walked home that evening, his voice still echoed faintly in his head, not as sound, but as a vibration under his skin. It made him wonder, why did that moment feel so different? Why did silence itself seem to lean forward when he spoke? Behavioral scientists have been asking the same question for years. At Stanford's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research, psychologists studying conversation pacing found that speech rhythm affects emotional trust more than content does. People listening to slow, evenly paced voices showed a 22% increase in oxytocin, the hormone of empathy and safety. Their breathing unconsciously synchronized with the speaker's pauses. That's what Walter had unknowingly done in that library room. He had slowed the air down. His pauses gave people's attention somewhere to rest. A 2019 Yale study on verbal presence discovered something similar. When older adults spoke with deliberate tempo, using lower frequencies and calm articulation, listeners' brains shifted activity from analytical to emotional zones. The researchers wrote, "In a fast communication culture, a slower voice doesn't signify delay, it signals depth. The body doesn't just hear voices, it feels them. Sound is vibration. Low tones travel through the chest cavity, resonating with the listener's own breath. That's why a teacher's or parent's calm tone can instantly quiet a restless room. It's not about command, it's about regulation. We borrow rhythm from those we trust." When Walter spoke, he didn't try to sound wise. He simply paused between sentences, let air exist. That tiny behavioral cue, restraint, carries neurological weight. According to a Harvard study on verbal empathy, listeners perceive speakers who pause and modulate tone as more thoughtful, more present, and more trustworthy. Even a 1.5-second pause before answering increased perceived sincerity by 18%. The science, in simple terms. Silence inside speech is a biological signal of care. But the research only explained part of it. The rest lived in culture. Anthropologists studying long-lived communities, from Okinawa to Sardinia, note how elders' voices hold social authority not because they dominate but because they contain calm. In Okinawa, there's a word, nuchi-gusue, life medicine. It refers to the healing quality of words spoken gently. They believe a steady voice can lower heart rate and tension in those who listen. And when that voice belongs to someone who has lived through storms, it carries the proof of survival. Walter didn't know the term, but he felt its truth. After the reading, one of the teenagers told him, "You don't talk like you're trying to win the room." And he laughed, because for years, that was exactly what teaching had trained him to do. Now, the quieter he became, the more people stayed. Behavioral communication labs call this resonant speech, the kind that slows collective tempo. In social psychology, it's linked to the entrainment effect, when listeners unconsciously adjust their heartbeat and breathing to match a speaker's pace. A slow, grounded rhythm literally pulls others into coherence. That's why a calm leader can steady a crisis room, and why a soft-spoken elder can hush an argument just by beginning a sentence. Walter began to notice it everywhere once he knew what to look for. The pastor who let his sentences land like stones in water. The radio host whose pauses felt like open doors. The elderly neighbor whose "good morning" somehow filled the whole porch. They all shared the same behavioral pattern, presence over projection. He realized something else: the world had grown allergic to pauses. People feared silence like a crack in the connection. They filled every gap with noise, apologies, words that rushed nowhere. But the brain doesn't thrive on constant sound, it thrives on rhythm. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin once wrote that our attention system works in waves, not streams. Without breaks, we stop processing meaning. A measured voice, especially one that has known age and loss, restores that natural wave. Walter's experience fit the science perfectly. When he spoke slower, others didn't tune out, they tuned in. His pauses weren't absence, they were invitation. He began reading more about how communication changes with age. Speech therapists call it tempo wisdom, as vocal cords stiffen and breath shortens, older speakers unconsciously prioritize clarity over speed. They trim excess words, lower volume, breathe between ideas. Ironically, that physical limitation becomes an emotional advantage. It forces sincerity. What aging took from his lungs, it gave back in gravity. A young man's voice wants to prove. An old man's voice just wants to land. Behavioral scientists describe that shift as authority through authenticity. The world doesn't need more loudness, it craves resonance, sound that carries weight without force. Walter had discovered, accidentally, what communication labs now train executives to relearn. How to speak so that people don't just hear you, they feel safe in your presence. That night, he sat at his kitchen table again, the same ticking clock marking time. He spoke a sentence into the quiet. Stillness isn't silence. It's the sound of being here. He didn't know it yet, but he had just named the science behind every calm teacher, every reassuring parent, every steady friend who could lower a room's heartbeat with a few measured words. He took a breath, long, even, grounded. And for the first time, he understood that aging hadn't taken his voice away. It had simply taught him how to use it. After that night at the library, Walter began to rebuild his days around sound, not the noise of the world, but the kind that teaches you to listen. He didn't think of it as self-improvement. He thought of it as learning how to arrive again. At 72, it wasn't ambition that moved him, it was curiosity. He wanted to know, what would happen if he gave his own voice a second chance to live with him, instead of for others. 1. Morning reading, reclaiming breath. Every morning, before the town woke, Walter opened the kitchen window to let in the wind from the river. He placed a worn book on the table, sometimes a poem, sometimes a newspaper article, and began to read out loud. Not for meaning, but for rhythm. He followed the advice of a communication therapist he'd read about: let your breath lead your words, not the other way around. At first, he stumbled, losing air midway through a sentence. The voice cracked. But soon, he noticed something strange: the slower he read, the more air he had. The act itself became a conversation between lungs and time. He realized that reading aloud wasn't about practice, it was about presence. When he heard his voice filling the quiet kitchen, he could feel the walls breathe with him. That was enough to start the day grounded. A behavioral study from Stanford confirmed what he was feeling. Reading aloud stimulates vagus nerve activity, the same nerve that calms the heart. In elderly participants, it reduced stress markers more effectively than silent meditation. The voice, when used gently, is medicine. 2. The recording habit, hearing without judgment. Every Sunday, Walter recorded himself reading for 5 minutes. He didn't edit. He didn't even listen right away. But at night, he'd play it back, hearing not just his tone but his state of mind. At first, it was uncomfortable. He noticed hesitation, the dry swallow before a difficult word, the sigh that escaped after a sentence. But over time, that discomfort turned into tenderness. He began hearing not imperfection, but honesty. Speech therapists call this mirror listening. When people hear their own calm voice played back, they subconsciously align their next speech to that calm pattern, a self-regulating feedback loop. It's how meditation teachers train tone, not by forcing gentleness, but by hearing it emerge. By the 3rd week, Walter noticed something else. His recorded voice no longer sounded old to him, it sounded real. There was grain in it, like the texture of wood after rain. He thought, maybe that's what age really does, it tunes you to the lower frequencies of truth. 3. The 2-second rule, power in the pause. At first, it started as an experiment. Whenever someone asked him a question, at the store, at the post office, on the phone, he waited 2 full seconds before replying. Those 2 seconds changed everything. People began leaning in instead of away. They spoke slower too, as if his quietness gave them permission. Behavioral psychology calls it the entrainment effect. When a calm speaker maintains a steady rhythm, listeners unconsciously synchronize, their breathing slows, their tone softens, conversation becomes cooperative instead of competitive. Walter once tested it with his neighbor, Tom, who always shouted across the fence about the weather. That morning, Walter answered in a low tone and didn't rush to fill silence. Within minutes, Tom's voice dropped too. By the end, both men were speaking softly enough that the sparrows on the wire didn't fly away. Walter smiled at the thought, stillness is contagious, if you let it be heard. 4. One younger person a week, the dialogue of generations. After the library reading, Denise invited him back once a week. Sometimes he read a short story, sometimes he just listened to the students talk about their plans. He learned to ask questions instead of giving answers. What made you choose that? What do you hear in your own voice when you talk about it? He noticed something remarkable. When he gave them silence instead of advice, they filled it with reflection instead of chatter. They started to trust that he wasn't waiting to correct them, he was present. One afternoon, a student named Maya stayed after everyone left. She said, "You sound like my grandfather used to, before he got sick. It makes me feel safe." The sentence caught him off guard. Safe, that was the word nobody had used for him in years. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Respect doesn't come from being remembered. It comes from giving others a space to be real." He began to call it his quiet mentorship. Not lectures, just presence. He didn't teach them to speak well, he taught them to pause well. 5. Body alignment, the invisible instrument. Every time Walter sat, he checked 3 things: shoulders down, chest open, feet flat. The first few days felt awkward, but within a week he realized his voice sounded stronger even without trying. Speech therapists confirm, posture determines resonance. A straight spine frees diaphragm movement, amplifying warmth and clarity. As one behavioral scientist from UCLA put it, when the body expands, the voice remembers it belongs to life. He noticed the link on an emotional level too. When he slouched, his words turned into small talk. When he sat upright, even casual remarks carried weight. It wasn't about confidence, it was about alignment between body and meaning. He thought of his late wife, who used to say, "Stand like your words matter." Now he finally understood she hadn't meant pride, she had meant integrity. 6. The reading group, sound as community. By spring, Walter joined a reading circle at the senior center. They met every Thursday evening in a small room with low lights and the smell of old books. There were no lectures, no analyses, just voices. Each person read a paragraph, then paused. No one interrupted. The silence between readers became the language itself. Sometimes, a poem would end, and no one would speak for a full minute. It wasn't awkward. It was reverent. He realized that when people gather around words instead of noise, they rediscover rhythm, the original social order of listening. A BBC feature he'd read called it acoustic belonging, how shared quietness rebuilds community faster than discussion does. It was true. He felt it every Thursday night, the steady breathing of 10 strangers moving together through the same sentence. After each session, they'd walk out under the streetlights in silence, but it never felt empty. It felt full. 7. The whisper of gratitude, closing the day. Before bed, Walter developed one final ritual. He sat by the window, placed his hand over his chest, and whispered 3 words, "Thank you, today." He didn't list reasons. He just let the phrase vibrate through his ribs. That whisper became an anchor. It tuned his nervous system before sleep, a behavioral trick supported by sleep psychologists from the University of British Columbia, who found that soft vocal gratitude lowered cortisol more effectively than written journaling. But Walter wasn't thinking about data. He just liked how it sounded in the dark, his own voice becoming part of the night's quiet choir of crickets, wind, and distance. He once told Denise, "Gratitude has a tone. You have to say it to hear it." She nodded, and later shared that line with her students. Weeks later, he overheard one of them whispering, "Thank you, today, after packing up. He smiled. The phrase had traveled on its own. The turning moment, mirror curve, bat sang. During one of the reading nights, a power outage hit the community center. The lights flickered out, phones glowed like tiny stars. People murmured, unsure what to do. Walter said quietly, "Let's keep reading." He continued in the dark, voice steady, almost musical. No one looked at their screens. The darkness thickened, but his tone made it safe. When he finished, there was no applause, only the soft sound of people breathing in sync. A student whispered, "When you speak, Mr. Greer, everyone stops scrolling." The line sank into him like a warm chord. He realized then, the modern world wasn't deaf. It was simply desperate for voices that didn't compete. That was the pivot, the moment of light in the mirror curve. He saw that what age had given him was not wisdom in words, but wisdom in pace. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He just needed to mean it. The human depth layer. The weeks that followed unfolded quietly, yet they changed his sense of identity. The routines, reading, pausing, aligning, listening, weren't habits anymore. They were rituals of dignity. Each one reminded him that respect isn't requested, it's resonated. He noticed how people started listening again. The barista asked about his day, the mailman lingered for small talk, the library students invited him to record their podcast intro because they liked his steady tone. The world hadn't changed. But his rhythm had, and rhythm, it turned out, changes everything. Behavioral science would describe it as environmental feedback loops, where small shifts in tempo influence the emotional field of everyone nearby. Walter called it something simpler, grace. He used to think aging meant fading out of relevance. Now he understood, aging was fine-tuning. Each decade lowered the pitch until what remained was frequency that only sincerity could sustain. That's why people still listened when he talked. Because beneath the gravel of his throat, there was peace. And peace always has an audience. Rain returned that night, the same slow drizzle that had followed him home from the library weeks before. Walter sat by the window again, his cup warm in his hands. The radio played softly, a late-night jazz program, the kind that left long spaces between notes. He liked those pauses. They reminded him that silence was not the opposite of music, it was part of it. Outside, the streetlights blurred into the wet pavement. The world had its own rhythm again. Drip, hum, breath. He realized he'd started living that way too, not in constant motion, but in steady presence. When the song ended, the host's voice came through the static. Tonight's theme is resonance, how sound carries when it's honest. Walter smiled. It felt like the universe had been listening. He thought about the moments that had shaped these quiet months. The library room where the air stilled around him. The students who stayed after class just to talk. The neighbor whose voice softened without realizing why. None of it had been planned. It all began the day he stopped trying to be heard. And started allowing himself to be felt. He turned the radio lower and read a few lines from his notebook. The voice doesn't age, it deepens. Silence is not absence, it's permission. For a long moment, he just sat there, listening to the sound of the rain finding its own pace against the roof. That's when he understood, the measure of a life isn't how much you say, but how much peace your words leave behind. He didn't need applause, or a crowd leaning in. He only needed the courage to keep speaking from stillness. He lifted his head, whispered to no one in particular. Your body never betrayed you, it just waited for you to listen. Because aging isn't losing life, it's learning its language. The clock ticked once, steady, kind, final. And in that moment, everything was quiet. But nothing felt silent. If this story reminded you of someone who carries quiet strength, share it with them. If you've ever felt unseen but still kept speaking gently, write in the comments, I understand. Maybe your words will steady someone else's day. The way a calm voice once steadied his. And if this story felt like a whisper you needed to hear tonight, save it, subscribe, and keep it close. Because sometimes, the smallest voices are the ones that teach us how to listen again.